Some acts of courage don't lead to glory, they lead to ruin. When a poor woodcutter threw himself between a raging bear and a falling princess, he expected nothing in return. What he got instead was a single stolen glance that would destroy everything he knew. One moment of connection beneath winter snow. One forbidden touch in a moonlit garden. One choice that would tear apart a kingdom and condemn them both to a fate worse than death. But this isn't a story about a rescue. It's about what happens when love becomes treason, when a child is born carrying secrets that could topple thrones, and when the most powerful people in the realm decide that some hearts are too dangerous to let keep beating. 7 years of separation. 7 years of grief so profound it carved hollows into their souls. 7 years believing they'd never see each other again. Until one autumn afternoon, when a little girl with familiar eyes appeared in the forest, and everything they thought they'd lost came flooding back with devastating, impossible force, because some loves refuse to die, even when the world has already buried them. The scream tore through the frozen air like a blade through flesh, sharp and desperate, shattering the oppressive silence of the winter forest. Elias dropped his axe, his breath catching in his throat as the sound echoed between the ancient pines. A woman's voice, high and terrified, cutting through the snowfall with a raw urgency that made his blood run cold. For a heartbeat, he stood paralyzed, his calloused hands trembling, not from the bitter cold, but from something primal awakening inside him. The recognition that whatever lay beyond those trees would change everything. He ran. His worn boots sank deep into the snow with each frantic stride, his lungs burning as frozen air tore through them. The forest seemed to close in around him, branches clawing at his threadbare cloak like skeletal fingers trying to hold him back. Through the white curtain of falling snow, he saw it. A massive brown bear, its fur matted with blood and ice, eyes wild with rage and pain. The beast stood on its hind legs, towering and monstrous, releasing a roar that shook the very ground beneath Elias's feet. Before it, a white horse reared in panic, and atop it, a young woman in fine clothes struggled to control the terrified animal. The royal standard on her saddle fluttered violently, its golden thread stained dark with what could only be blood. Something was terribly wrong. Nobles didn't travel alone through these woods. Not in winter. Not ever. Elias didn't think. There was no time for thought, no space for reason or self-preservation. His body moved on instinct, driven by something deeper than fear or logic. He lunged between the bear and its prey, his woodcutter's axe raised high, feeling the inadequacy of the weapon even as his muscles tensed for impact. The bear's massive paw swept toward him, claws like curved daggers catching the dim winter light. Time fractured into fragments, the metallic taste of terror on his tongue, the thunderous beating of his heart threatening to burst from his chest, the weight of his entire meaningless existence condensing into this single, impossible moment. The clash was brutal and chaotic. Iron met flesh and bone. The bear's roar mixed with Elias's guttural cry as the axe found its mark, biting deep into the creature's shoulder. Blood sprayed across pristine snow, painting it crimson and wrong. The bear's strength was overwhelming, its wounded rage amplified beyond reason. Elias felt ribs crack as a glancing blow sent him sprawling, the world spinning, snow and sky becoming indistinguishable. Pain exploded through his side, white-hot and blinding. Yet somehow, through the haze of agony, he rose again, driven by a will he didn't know he possessed. The axe swung once more, and this time, the bear's roar transformed into something else, a wet, gurgling sound that spoke of endings. Then silence. Terrible, ringing silence that pressed against his eardrums like water at depth. The bear collapsed, its massive body shaking the earth one final time before going still. Elias stood swaying, blood dripping from his forehead into his eyes, his entire body a symphony of pain. But it wasn't the pain that made him tremble. It was what he saw when the world finally stopped spinning. She lay in the snow where she'd fallen, her dark hair spread like ink across the white canvas, her face pale as moonlight on ice. Her riding gown, rich velvet and deep burgundy, was torn and stained, but it was her eyes that struck him dumb. Eyes that opened slowly, focusing on him with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time in his entire life. Princess Amalia. He'd heard her name whispered in the village, spoken with the reverence reserved for distant, untouchable things. Yet here she was, broken and vulnerable, looking at him not with the cold superiority of nobility, but with something that made his chest tighten painfully, raw, profound gratitude mixed with something deeper, something forbidden. "You..." Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling and soft, each word an effort. "You saved me." Ilias couldn't speak. His throat had closed completely, sealed by an emotion so overwhelming it threatened to crush him. He extended a hand, rough, scarred, filthy with bear blood and forest dirt, and she took it without hesitation. Her fingers were delicate and cold, trembling against his calloused palm. When he helped her stand, she stumbled, and for a brief, eternal moment, she fell against him, her weight pressing into his chest. He could feel her heartbeat, rapid and frightened, matching his own. Could smell the faint perfume in her hair, mixed with the copper scent of blood and the sharp bite of winter pine. Time stopped. The forest held its breath. In that suspended moment, something impossible and terrifying took root between them, a connection that had no place in the rigid world of peasants and princesses, a knowing that what had just occurred transcended the simple act of rescue. Her eyes searched his face with an intensity that felt like being stripped bare, seeing not just the poor woodcutter but something else, something he'd never dared believe existed within himself. Distant shouts shattered the spell. Guards, finally responding to the commotion, their voices carrying through the trees with harsh urgency. Reality came crashing back, brutal and unforgiving. The princess's expression shifted, a veil of nobility descending over that raw vulnerability. "Go," she whispered urgently, her hand still clasping his. "They cannot find you here. They won't understand." Elias wanted to speak, to say something that would capture the enormity of what had just passed between them, but words were tools he'd never learned to wield. Instead, he stepped back, his hand slipping from hers, leaving them both reaching across an invisible divide. He turned and ran, plunging back into the forest's embrace, his heart pounding not from exertion but from the earthquake that had just reshaped his entire world. He didn't realize until much later, when he'd reached the safety of his small cabin, that something had caught on his cloak, a golden ribbon, torn from her riding dress, still carrying her scent. He held it in his trembling hands as night fell, staring at this small, impossible token of a moment that should never have existed. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the pines with a sound almost like voices. Whispers that would carry his name through the forest and into places where peasants' names were never spoken. Into the heart of a princess who lay awake that night in her gilded chamber, unable to forget the eyes of the man who'd thrown himself between her and death without a moment's hesitation. From that day forward, Elias's name would be whispered on the winter wind, and in the imprisoned heart of a princess who'd discovered that salvation sometimes came from the most unexpected places, wearing the face of a simple woodcutter who'd made her feel, for one brief, impossible moment, truly seen. The months that followed were torture of the slowest, cruelest kind. Elias returned to his routine, chopping wood, hauling water from the frozen stream, existing in the mechanical rhythm of survival, but everything had changed. The golden ribbon remained hidden beneath his straw mattress, a secret he touched only in the darkest hours of night when loneliness became unbearable. Each time his fingers traced its delicate weave, he felt her presence like a ghost against his skin, heard her whispered warning echoing through his mind. "They cannot find you here. They won't understand." He knew she was right. The world had no space for what had passed between them in that snow-covered clearing. Yet knowing this didn't stop the ache that had taken residence in his chest, growing heavier with each passing day. Winter gave way to spring, then summer's oppressive heat, and finally autumn's golden decay. The village continued its timeless dance of survival, planting, harvesting, surviving. Elias spoke little, worked hard, and tried desperately to forget eyes that haunted his dreams with an intensity that felt like madness. But fate, it seemed, had different plans. On a morning when frost first kissed the ground again, a rider appeared on the dirt road leading to his cabin. The horse was magnificent, A warhorse, muscled and proud, and the man atop it wore the royal colors, a sealed letter clutched in his gauntleted hand. "You are Elias, the woodcutter?" The messenger's voice carried the sharp edge of authority, each word clipped and formal. Elias's heart stopped, then started again with painful, thunderous beats. "I am." The letter was pressed into his hands with ceremonial gravity. The royal seal, a golden lion against crimson wax, felt hot against his calloused palm, as if it burned with the weight of what it represented. "The king seeks the man who saved Princess Amalia's life. You are summoned to the castle. There will be a reward." The messenger departed before Elias could form words, leaving him standing alone with the letter trembling in his grip. A reward. The word felt hollow, meaningless. What reward could match the memory of her heartbeat against his chest, the feeling of her hand in his? Yet beneath the fear and confusion, something else stirred, a desperate, shameful hope. He would see her again. The thought was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. For 3 days, Elias wrestled with the decision. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings. The castle was a place of power and intrigue, where peasants were crushed beneath the wheels of noble ambition without thought. But the irrational part, the part that had taken root that winter day, would not be silenced. On the 4th morning, he packed his few belongings, tucked the golden ribbon into his shirt where it rested against his heart, and began the long walk to the capital. The castle rose from the landscape like a monument to everything Elias was not. Powerful, permanent, untouchable. Its walls were massive stone edifices that seemed to scrape the sky itself, towers reaching upward with an arrogance that made him feel smaller with each step. The golden gates stood open, but crossing their threshold felt like passing through a portal into another world entirely. Guards in polished armor watched him with barely concealed contempt, their eyes dismissing him as easily as one would dismiss an insect. He wanted to run, to flee back to the forest where he understood the rules of survival, but his legs carried him forward as if pulled by invisible strings. Inside, the contrast was staggering and obscene. The great hall stretched before him like a cathedral of excess, vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of conquest and glory, chandeliers dripping with more candles than his village would use in a year, tapestries worth more than everything he'd ever owned combined. Nobles laughed and drank from jeweled goblets, their clothes shimmering with silk and gold thread, their voices carrying the careless confidence of those who'd never known hunger's sharp bite. Servants moved between them like shadows, invisible and silent, their backs bent under the weight of endless servitude. Beauty and cruelty, opulence and suffering, they existed side by side, so intertwined that separating them seemed impossible. Elias stood frozen, acutely aware of his rough wool tunic, his mud-stained boots, the smell of wood smoke and labor that clung to him like a second skin. He didn't belong here. Every fiber of his being screamed this truth. Then the room shifted, conversations dimming to murmurs, all eyes turning toward the grand staircase. She descended slowly, each step measured and graceful, and Elias forgot how to breathe. Princess Amalia wore a gown of deep emerald velvet that caught the candlelight and transformed it into liquid fire. Her dark hair was arranged in elaborate braids woven with pearls, her neck adorned with jewels that probably cost more than his entire village. She was radiant, untouchable, every inch the royal princess. But it was her face that destroyed him. That same face he'd seen pale against snow, now composed and distant, beautiful in a way that felt like a weapon designed specifically to wound him. Their eyes met across the vast expanse of the hall, and time fractured. For one heartbeat, 2, 3, he saw recognition flash across her features. A widening of the eyes, a barely perceptible intake of breath, the slightest tremor in her carefully controlled expression. She knew him. Of course she knew him. How could she forget? But then, like a door slamming shut, her expression smoothed into polished neutrality. She looked through him, past him, as if he were merely another servant among dozens, unworthy of notice or memory. The pain was immediate and devastating, a physical blow that knocked the air from his lungs. Elias understood then, with brutal clarity, what he'd been too foolish to accept before. That moment in the forest had been an aberration, a temporary suspension of the world's rigid order. Here, in this place of power and protocol, such moments couldn't exist. She was a princess, destined for political marriages and dynastic duty. He was nothing. A peasant, a tool that had served its purpose and could now be discarded with appropriate payment. Yet even as she maintained her mask of indifference, Elias caught something in the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands clasped together with slightly too much force, white knuckles betraying tension beneath the composed surface. The disguise wasn't effortless. It cost her something. This realization didn't ease his pain. If anything, it made everything worse. They were both trapped, prisoners of a world that would never allow them to acknowledge what had passed between them. The king spoke, his voice booming with practiced authority, offering gold and gratitude for the rescue of his beloved daughter. Elias heard the words from a great distance, responding mechanically, accepting the heavy purse of coins with numb hands. The entire ceremony felt surreal, a performance in which he'd been given a role without understanding the script. Through it all, he was hyper-aware of her presence, the way she stood perfectly still, the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the fact that she never, not once, looked at him again. That night, Elias was given quarters in the servants' wing, a small room with a narrow bed, infinitely more comfortable than his cabin, yet feeling like a cell. He sat on the edge of the mattress, the purse of gold forgotten on the floor, staring at the door as moonlight crept through the single window. The ache in his chest had grown into something monstrous, a living thing that consumed him from within. He'd been a fool to come here, a fool to hope that crossing the threshold of the castle meant crossing into a world where they could exist together. He was preparing for a sleepless night when he heard it, the soft whisper of parchment sliding across stone. A letter appearing beneath his door as if by magic, unmarked and sealed with wax that carried no crest. Elias's hands shook as he retrieved it, broke the seal, unfolded the paper. The handwriting was elegant and feminine, the ink still slightly wet, and the scent that rose from the page was unmistakable, lavender and rose, the same fragrance that had clung to the golden ribbon for months. The message was brief, just a few lines, but they rewrote his entire world. Midnight. The garden beneath the angel statue. Come alone, please. There was no signature, no name, but none was needed. Elias clutched the letter to his chest, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. The rational part of his mind whispered warnings. This was dangerous, forbidden, potentially fatal. Meeting a princess in secret darkness could mean his death if discovered. But the other part, the part that had been slowly dying since that winter day, roared back to life with desperate intensity. That night, while the castle slept and moonlight painted the world in shades of silver and shadow, Elias would discover that some letters carried more weight than gold, and some invitations were worth any risk, even death itself. The castle at midnight was a different creature entirely, a labyrinth of shadows and whispered secrets where even the stones seemed to hold their breath. Elias moved through the darkened corridors like a ghost, his heart threatening to betray him with its thunderous beating. Every creak of floorboard, every distant sound made him freeze, certain that guards would emerge from the darkness to drag him away. The letter burned against his chest where he'd hidden it, its words repeating endlessly in his mind like a prayer or a curse. Midnight. The garden. Come alone. Each step took him further from safety and deeper into a world where discovery meant death. Yet he couldn't stop, couldn't turn back, pulled forward by a force stronger than survival instinct. The garden entrance loomed before him, an arched doorway wreathed in climbing roses that had long since shed their blooms for winter's approach. Beyond it, moonlight painted everything in shades of silver and blue, transforming the familiar world into something dreamlike and unreal. The air carried the scent of damp earth and dying flowers, mixed with something else. Incense from the monastery beyond the castle walls, the distant chanting of monks performing their midnight prayers, drifting on the wind like ghosts of devotion. The sound was haunting, beautiful, and mournful, a reminder that even here, in this stolen moment, the world continued its eternal rhythms of faith and duty. Elias stepped into the garden, and the temperature dropped noticeably, as if he'd crossed into a space outside normal time. Frost kissed the grass beneath his feet, each blade crystalline and fragile in the moonlight. Rose bushes heavy with dew lined the winding paths, their thorns glistening like tiny daggers. At the garden's heart stood the statue, a stone angel, wings spread wide but broken, one arm reaching skyward while the other lay shattered on the ground. Something about the angel's face struck him as profoundly sad, as if the sculptor had captured the exact moment of a fall from grace. Beneath its shadow, wrapped in a dark cloak that made her nearly invisible against the night, stood Amalia. She turned at his approach, and even in the darkness, he could see her face. Pale, drawn, eyes wide with an emotion that looked dangerously close to panic. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, separated by mere feet that felt like an unbridgeable chasm. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, filled with everything they couldn't say, everything the world forbade them to feel. "You came." Her voice was barely audible, trembling with relief and terror in equal measure. "I wasn't sure you would. After today, after I pretended not to know you, I thought—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, her composure cracking at the edges. "I would have walked through fire if you'd asked." The words left Elias before he could stop them, raw and honest in a way that made him feel stripped bare. His hands hung uselessly at his sides, still calloused and scarred, still covered in the dirt of labor that no amount of washing could fully remove. He was acutely aware of the contrast between them, her refined beauty against his rough edges, her silk cloak against his worn wool. "But you didn't know me today. In the hall you looked right through me." Pain flickered across her face, so intense it made him regret the accusation immediately. "I had to," she whispered, and now her voice broke completely. "If they suspected, even for a moment, that I felt anything for you beyond gratitude, Elias, they would destroy you. My father, the nobles, they would crush you like an insect and never lose a moment's sleep over it. I can't." Tears caught the moonlight as they slid down her cheeks, and seeing them felt like watching something sacred and terrible simultaneously. He moved without thinking, closing the distance between them, his rough hands reaching for her face with a gentleness that contradicted their scarred surface. She leaned into his touch as if it were the only thing keeping her upright, and for a moment they simply stood there, breathing the same air, existing in the same impossible space. "I shouldn't have called you here," Amalia said, but she made no move to pull away. "It was selfish and dangerous and wrong. But after months of pretending that day in the forest never happened, pretending I don't think about you every waking moment." She stopped, her eyes searching his face with desperate intensity. "Do you know what it's like? Living in a golden cage, surrounded by luxury and suffocation? Every day is the same. Endless protocols, meaningless conversations. My father's plans for my future being discussed as if I'm a piece on a chessboard, rather than a person." Her words came faster now, spilling out like water through a broken dam. She spoke of the castle as a beautiful prison, of duties that felt like chains, of the arranged marriage to Duke Fernando, a man twice her age with cruel eyes and a reputation for brutality toward his servants. She spoke of lying awake at night, remembering the feeling of Elias's arms around her as he helped her stand in the snow. The way he'd looked at her not as a princess or a political asset, but as a human being worth dying for. "No one has ever looked at me the way you did that day," she whispered. "Not as something to possess or control, but as someone to protect. Do you understand how rare that is in this world? How precious?" Elias felt his throat tighten painfully. "You saved me too, you know. Before that day, I was just existing, working, surviving, waiting to die without ever having really lived. Then you appeared and suddenly everything meant something. Every sunrise, every breath. They all became important because they were bringing me closer to this moment, to seeing you again." The confession hung between them, too honest, too dangerous, too true to take back. Amalia's breath hitched, and then she was moving, closing the last remaining distance, her arms wrapping around him with desperate strength. Elias held her, feeling her tremble against him, aware of how fragile she felt despite her royal bearing, how human and vulnerable and real. Her hair smelled of lavender and rose, her silk cloak smooth beneath his calloused palms, But none of these details mattered as much as the simple fact that she was here, in his arms, choosing this moment despite its impossibility. "Promise me something," she whispered against his chest. "Promise me that no matter what happens, no matter how long we're separated or what the world demands of us, you'll remember this. That for one moment, we were just Elias and Amalia, not peasant and princess, not duty and survival, just two people who found something real in a world of lies." "I promise," he said, and the words felt like a sacred vow, weighted with meaning that transcended the simple syllables. They stood beneath the broken angel for what felt like hours or seconds. Time had lost all meaning in this space outside the normal world. But reality, cruel and inevitable, began to intrude. Distant footsteps echoed from somewhere in the castle. A dog barked. The monk's chanting shifted to a different prayer, marking the passage of forbidden time. Amalia pulled back, her face anguished. "You have to go. If anyone sees us—" "I know." But Elias didn't move, couldn't make his body obey the command to leave her. "When will I see you again?" "I don't know. I'll find a way, I promise. But it might be—" She stopped, listening. The footsteps were growing louder, more distinct. Multiple people moving with purpose through the gardens. Panic flashed across her face. "Go. Now. Through the rose garden there's a servant's gate." But Elias had already seen it. Movement in the shadows. A figure standing between two marble columns, watching them. His blood turned to ice. Someone had been there the entire time, witnessing everything. When he turned back to warn Amalia, the figure had vanished, melted into darkness as if it had never existed. Only one thing remained, a leather glove, dropped on the ground where the observer had stood, its fine craftsmanship marking it as belonging to someone of significant rank. Amalia saw it too, and the color drained from her face completely. "No," she breathed. "No, no, no." Elias grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me. Whatever happens, I don't regret this, not for a single second. Do you understand?" She nodded, tears streaming freely now. And then he was running, plunging back into the castle's maze of corridors, his heart pounding with adrenaline and terror, and something that felt dangerously close to joy. Behind him, he heard Amalia's footsteps retreating in a different direction, and he prayed to whatever gods might be listening that she would make it back to her chambers unseen. The next morning, the castle buzzed with whispers and tension. The head gardener had been dismissed without explanation. The king had called an emergency council meeting, and Princess Amalia remained locked in her chambers, refusing all visitors. But what made Elias's blood run cold was the announcement posted in the servants' quarters. By direct order of the princess herself, he was being promoted to the position of royal gardener, effective immediately. The promotion was a noose disguised as honor, and Elias felt it tightening around his neck with each passing day. As royal gardener, he was granted access to spaces previously forbidden: the inner courtyards, the private terraces, the very gardens where he and Amalia had shared that stolen moment beneath the broken angel. But this proximity was torture of the most exquisite kind. He saw her daily now, always at a distance, always surrounded by guards and courtiers and the suffocating protocols of royal life, yet never close enough to speak, to touch, to acknowledge the connection that pulsed between them like a living thing. The castle staff whispered about his sudden elevation. Some attributed it to the king's gratitude for saving the princess. Others, with darker suspicions gleaming in their eyes, suggested more scandalous explanations. Elias heard the murmurs, felt the weight of suspicious gazes, and understood with growing dread that his new position had placed him directly in the crosshairs of court intrigue. He was a pawn in a game whose rules he didn't understand, moved by forces he couldn't see, and the board was tilting dangerously toward disaster. Winter's grip had tightened on the kingdom, transforming the castle into a fortress of ice and stone. The great winter banquet approached, an annual celebration where nobles from across the realm gathered to display their wealth, forge alliances, and engage in the elaborate dance of power that sustained the aristocracy. Preparations consumed the castle. Servants rushed through corridors carrying bolts of silk and crates of wine. Cooks labored day and night over elaborate dishes, and tension hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. On the night of the banquet, Elias found himself pressed into service alongside other household staff. The great hall had been transformed into something from a fever dream. Hundreds of candles casting dancing shadows across walls, hung with tapestries depicting legendary battles, tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats and exotic fruits, the air thick with the scent of spiced wine and burning incense. Musicians played from a gallery above, their melodies weaving through conversations and laughter with hypnotic insistence. The nobles arrived in waves of silk and velvet, jewels catching candlelight and throwing it back in dazzling fragments. They moved through the hall like colorful birds, preening and posturing, their laughter sharp-edged and calculated. Elias, dressed in the servant's livery that marked him as invisible, moved between them with a silver pitcher of wine, filling goblets while remaining unseen, a ghost among the living, present but unacknowledged. Then she entered, and the room shifted imperceptibly, conversations pausing for half a heartbeat before resuming with forced normalcy. Princess Amalia wore midnight blue silk that seemed to capture and hold starlight, her dark hair arranged in an elaborate style that left her neck bare except for a necklace of sapphires that probably cost more than his village would earn in a lifetime. But it was her companion that made Elias's stomach twist with sick recognition. Duke Fernando, the man she'd spoken of with such quiet dread in the garden. He was older, his face handsome in a hard, cruel way, with eyes that moved across the room like a predator assessing prey. His hand rested possessively on Amalia's arm, and she stood rigid beside him, her smile brittle and false, a mask so fragile Elias feared it would shatter at any moment. Their eyes met across the crowded hall for a fraction of a second. In that brief connection, Elias saw everything, her fear, her desperation, her silent plea for understanding. Then she looked away, laughing at something the Duke said, and the sound was so hollow, it made Elias's chest ache with physical pain. This was her future then. This cruel man with his calculating eyes and possessive touch. This was what duty demanded, what the world required of a princess. The injustice of it burned through him like acid. He served wine mechanically, his hands steady despite the rage and helplessness churning in his gut. The nobles talked around him as if he were furniture, discussing politics, marriages, land disputes, the price of loyalty, and the cost of betrayal. Their words painted a picture of a world where people were commodities, where love was weakness, and power was the only currency that mattered. The feast reached its peak of excess, course after elaborate course, wine flowing like water, music growing louder and more frenzied. Then, like a stone dropped into still water, a single voice cut through the revelry. A servant, young and drunk on wine he'd stolen from the kitchens, his words slurred but carrying with devastating clarity across the suddenly silent hall. "Saw him myself, I did," he announced to no one and everyone swaying on his feet. "A man and a lady in the garden, past midnight, all wrapped up in each other like—" He made a crude gesture, and several nobles gasped with scandalized delight. The temperature in the hall plummeted. Elias felt the blood drain from his face, his hands going numb around the wine pitcher. Across the room, Amalia had gone deathly pale, her eyes wide with barely contained terror. The Duke's expression shifted from amusement to dark suspicion, his grip on her arm visibly tightening. "Enough!" The king's voice boomed like thunder, reverberating off stone walls. He rose from his throne, his face purple with rage. "Remove this drunken fool and find out what nonsense he speaks of. If there's truth to these accusations, I will know of it. No one makes a mockery of my daughter's honor." Guards moved forward, dragging the protesting servant away, but the damage was done. The hall buzzed with whispered speculation, nobles leaning together with barely suppressed excitement, feeding on scandal like vultures on carrion. The king ordered an immediate investigation, his words sharp and terrible, promising severe punishment for anyone involved in impropriety. Elias wanted to run, to flee the castle and disappear into the forest where he belonged, but moving would draw attention, mark him as guilty. So he remained frozen, the wine pitcher trembling imperceptibly in his hands, feeling the walls closing in. The banquet continued, but the mood had soured. Pleasure curdled into tension and suspicion. Elias caught fragments of conversation, speculation about the mysterious lovers, theories ranging from scandalous to absurd. nobles placing bets on who would be implicated. Through it all, he was hyper-aware of Amalia, sitting rigid and silent beside the Duke, her face a mask of composure that must have cost her everything to maintain. Hours crawled past like wounded animals. When the banquet finally ended and guests began dispersing to their chambers, Elias retreated to the servants' quarters, his mind racing. They would investigate. They would question everyone. The glove they'd left behind, the timing of his promotion, the countless small details that seemed innocent in isolation but damning when assembled. It would all come together, forming a picture of guilt that would destroy them both. He was preparing for sleepless vigil when he heard the softest knock on his door, so quiet, he almost dismissed it as imagination. Opening it with trembling hands, he found the corridor empty except for shadows and moonlight. Then he looked down. A sealed letter lay at his feet, and even before picking it up, he knew who it was from. Inside, her handwriting was rushed, desperate. The stables. 1 hour. They're watching everywhere, but I must see you. This might be our last chance. Elias's hands shook as he read the words again and again, trying to decipher meaning beyond the obvious. Last chance. The finality of it settled in his chest like ice. Whatever happened next would change everything, seal their fates in ways neither could control. Going to her now, after the servant's drunken revelation, after the king's furious decree, was madness. It was suicide. It guaranteed their discovery and destruction. He should burn the letter. Should stay in his room, maintain the fiction of innocence, hope that suspicion passed him by. Should choose survival over this impossible, forbidden connection that would only end in tragedy. Instead, he found himself moving through the darkened castle toward the stables, drawn by a force stronger than reason or self-preservation. The building loomed ahead, hay-scented and warm, horses shifting restlessly in their stalls, as if sensing the tension crackling through the air. Inside, Amalia waited, wrapped in a simple cloak, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking more beautiful and terrified than he'd ever seen her. "They'll discover everything," she said without preamble, her voice breaking. "The investigation, the questions. Someone will talk, someone will piece it together. My father will demand answers. And when he learns the truth—" She stopped, unable to speak the consequences they both understood. "Elias, if they discover us, they'll kill you. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, as an example. I won't let that happen." "Then let them," Elias said, and the words came from somewhere deep and true, a place beyond fear or calculation. He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Let the whole castle collapse around us. Let them discover everything. But don't ask me to pretend I don't love you, because I won't. I can't. Not anymore." Tears streamed down her face, catching moonlight that filtered through gaps in the stable walls. "You're insane. They'll destroy you." "Then let the whole world burn," he whispered, pulling her close. "But right now, in this moment, I choose you. I choose this. Consequences be damned." Their lips met with desperate intensity, a kiss that tasted of salt and fear and defiance, a declaration of war against a world determined to keep them apart. Around them, the horses shifted and stamped, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the stable walls, footsteps approached with terrible, inevitable purpose. Thunder cracked across the sky like God himself passing judgment, and in that instant of illumination, a figure appeared in the stable doorway, dark and silent, watching them with eyes that held their doom. Dawn broke cold and merciless over the castle, but Elias didn't see it. He'd been awake all night, waiting for guards that never came, for the arrest that seemed inevitable after that figure had materialized in the stable doorway. But the hours had passed in agonizing silence, and now morning light filtered through his window with an almost mocking normalcy, as if the world hadn't fundamentally shifted on its axis the night before. His mind replayed the moment endlessly. The thunder crack, the silhouette in the doorway, Amalia's sharp intake of breath as they broke apart. Then nothing. The figure had vanished as mysteriously as it appeared, leaving them trembling in the darkness, terror replacing passion with brutal efficiency. The castle bells rang for morning prayers, their sound hollow and foreboding. Elias dressed mechanically, his hands moving through familiar motions, while his mind raced with desperate calculations. They should run, should flee while darkness still offered cover, disappear into the forest and never look back. But even as the thought formed, he knew its futility. Where could a peasant and a princess hide? How far would they get before the king's guards hunted them down like animals? And what kind of life would that be? Always running, always afraid, love poisoned by constant terror. The answer came with terrible swiftness. He'd barely descended to the servants' quarters when he felt it, the wrongness permeating the air like smoke from an unseen fire. Servants moved through corridors with unusual haste, their faces tight with barely suppressed panic. Whispered conversations died when he approached, replaced by significant looks and uncomfortable silences. Something had happened, something catastrophic. Haven't you heard? A kitchen maid grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with the morbid excitement that accompanies disaster. The princess, she's gone, vanished in the night without a trace. The king's men are tearing the castle apart, searching for her. The world tilted sickeningly. Gone. The word echoed in Elias's skull with the finality of a death knell. She'd run. After their meeting in the stables, after the witness who'd surely reported them to the king, she'd chosen flight over the inevitable consequences. But alone, without telling him, the betrayal cut deeper than any blade. Even as rational thought whispered that this was mercy, she was protecting him, removing herself as evidence, giving him plausible deniability. The castle descended into chaos. Guards flooded every corridor, ransacking chambers and interrogating servants with increasing aggression. The king's rage was legendary, his roars echoing through stone halls as he demanded answers no one could provide. How had his daughter escaped? Who had helped her? Where had she gone? The questions came with threats of execution, torture, the complete destruction of anyone found complicit in her disappearance. By midday, they came for Elias. 6 guards, led by the captain himself, their expressions grim and unyielding. By order of the king, you're under arrest for treason. The words were formal, practiced, carrying the weight of absolute authority. Evidence suggests you conspired in the princess's escape. You will be held for questioning. I don't know where she is, Elias said, and the truth of it made his voice ring with desperate honesty. I swear it. I haven't seen her since... He stopped, realizing that any timeline he provided would incriminate him further. They dragged him to the dungeons, dark, fetid chambers beneath the castle, where stone walls wept moisture and the air tasted of despair and human suffering. The cell was barely large enough to stand in, the floor covered in filthy straw that did nothing to soften the cold seeping up from the earth. An iron door clanged shut with terrible finality, and Elias was alone in darkness, listening to distant screams from other prisoners and the scurrying of rats. Hours became days, though in the absolute blackness, time lost all meaning. They questioned him repeatedly, the king's interrogators with their cold eyes and methodical cruelty, demanding confessions he couldn't provide because he genuinely didn't know where Amalia had gone. Each session left him weaker, his body accumulating bruises and cuts, but he clung stubbornly to the truth. He hadn't helped her escape, didn't know her plans. The lie of omission, that he'd met her in the stables, that they'd kissed with desperate passion, felt like the only shield protecting her reputation, the only thing he could still give her. Tell us where she is, and the king might show mercy. They said again and again, the words becoming a monotonous refrain. But Elias remained silent, taking their blows with gritted teeth, finding strength in the knowledge that his suffering protected her, wherever she was. Then, on what he thought was the 7th day, or perhaps the 10th, time had become meaningless. The cell door opened. Not guards this time, but the king himself, flanked by advisors and the Duke Fernando, whose face was twisted with barely contained fury. The king looked older than Elias remembered, worn down by worry and rage, his royal bearing cracked by parental fear. "Speak," the king commanded, his voice rough with exhaustion. "My daughter is missing. My only child, the future of this kingdom, vanished like morning mist. If you know anything, anything at all, tell me now, and I swear you'll be shown leniency." Elias looked up from his position on the floor, his vision blurred by swelling and fatigue. For a moment, he almost spoke, almost told them about the stables, the kiss, the figure in the doorway. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the Duke's expression, hungry and vindictive. Perhaps it was the memory of Amalia's tears as she'd spoken of her arranged marriage. Perhaps it was simply stubborn love refusing to be extinguished by pain and fear. "I saved her life once," Elias said quietly, each word an effort through split lips, "when no one else could or would. That's all I know, Your Majesty, that I would die before bringing her harm." The king stared at him for a long moment, some complex emotion flickering across his weathered face. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a devotion he couldn't understand but couldn't entirely dismiss. Then his expression hardened again. "Very well. If you won't speak, you'll hang at dawn as a traitor and conspirator. Let your death serve as warning to anyone else who would betray their sovereign." They left him in darkness, the death sentence hanging over him like a physical weight. Elias should have been terrified. In hours he would mount the gallows, feel the rope tighten around his neck, experience the final drop into oblivion. But strangely, a sort of peace settled over him. At least in death, they couldn't force him to betray Amalia. At least his silence would be eternal, unbreakable. Night fell, his last night, and Elias prepared for the end with surprising calm. He thought of his cabin in the forest, of simple days chopping wood and hauling water. Thought of the moment he'd first seen Amalia lying in the snow, of her eyes opening and recognizing something in him he'd never known existed. Thought of stolen moments in gardens and stables, of a love so impossible it could only end this way, with him dying for her without her ever knowing the full extent of his sacrifice. The cell door opened one final time. He expected guards come to lead him to execution, but instead, a hooded figure slipped inside, moving with desperate urgency. When the hood fell back, Elias's heart stopped. Amalia stood before him, her face pale and drawn, her elegant gowns replaced by rough peasant clothes. In her arms, wrapped in a simple blanket, was a baby, tiny, sleeping, utterly vulnerable. The child's face was perfect in the way newborns are, features soft and undefined. But even in the dim torchlight filtering through the cell door, Elias saw it. The shape of the eyes, the curve of the mouth. "This is my daughter," Amalia whispered, her voice breaking with emotion so raw it was painful to witness. "Elias, she was born with your eyes." The words hit him like a physical blow, stealing breath and coherence. His daughter. Their daughter. The impossibility of it warred with the undeniable truth staring at him from that tiny, perfect face. 9 months. He counted backward, his mind sluggish with shock and exhaustion. The garden. That night beneath the broken angel when they'd... "I didn't know," Amalia continued, tears streaming down her face. "Not at first. By the time I realized, they'd already announced my marriage to Fernando. I tried to hide it, tried to figure out what to do, but eventually it became impossible to conceal. The Duke discovered the truth and threatened to expose everything unless I married him immediately and claimed the child as his. I couldn't let him raise our daughter, Elias. Couldn't let her grow up in that monster's shadow. So I ran." She sank to her knees beside him, the baby still cradled protectively in her arms. "I'm so sorry. For leaving without telling you, for letting you suffer here while I..." Her voice dissolved into sobs. "But I had to keep her safe. Had to get far enough away that they couldn't find us, couldn't take her and use her as leverage against me." Elias reached out with trembling hands, touching the baby's face with a gentleness that contradicted his battered state. His daughter. The concept was too vast to comprehend, too precious to be real. She stirred at his touch, tiny features scrunching up, and when her eyes opened briefly, he saw it clearly. His own eyes staring back at him from an impossibly small face. "Why did you come back?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer, dreaded it with every fiber of his being. "Because they're going to kill you at dawn," Amalia said, her voice fierce despite the tears. "And I couldn't let you die believing I'd abandoned you, believing the love we shared meant nothing. You deserve to know that you have a daughter, that our love created something beautiful and real. You deserve. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Heavy boots, multiple guards, moving with purpose toward the cell. Amalia's face went white with terror. They found me. Someone must have followed. She thrust the baby toward him with desperate urgency, pressing something else into his hands. A ring, ornate and unmistakably royal. The king's own seal glinting in the torchlight. Take this. Use it if you must. And promise me you'll remember that I loved you. That I will always. The cell door burst open, guards flooding in, and Amalia was torn away from him, her screams echoing off stone walls as they dragged her backward. The baby began crying, a thin, piercing wail that cut through the chaos like a knife. Elias clutched both child and ring, watching helplessly as the woman he loved disappeared into the darkness beyond the cell door. Her final words echoing with terrible finality. Her name is Elena. Tell her about me. Tell her everything. Then she was gone, and Elias was alone with a crying infant, a royal ring, and the crushing weight of a love that had destroyed everything it touched while somehow creating the most precious thing in the world. The baby's cries shattered the dungeon's oppressive silence, each wail a piercing accusation that echoed off stone walls and seemed to multiply in the darkness. Elias held her awkwardly, his battered hands trembling as he tried to quiet her. Having no experience with infants, no understanding of how to comfort this tiny creature who shared his blood. Elena. Her name was Elena. He whispered it like a prayer, like an incantation that might somehow make sense of the chaos engulfing them. She was so small, so impossibly fragile, her face red and scrunched with distress, and looking at her filled him with terror more profound than any he'd felt facing his own execution. The guards had taken Amalia away, her screams still reverberating in his memory with haunting clarity. What would they do to her? The question clawed at his mind with vicious insistence. She was the princess, yes, but she'd fled her arranged marriage, hidden a pregnancy, returned to help a condemned traitor, crimes that could carry their own death sentence, royal blood or not. And the Duke, that cruel man with his vindictive eyes, would surely demand the harshest punishment possible. Hours crawled by in agonizing uncertainty. Elena eventually exhausted herself into fitful sleep, her tiny body curled against his chest, seeking warmth he could barely provide in the dungeon's bone-deep cold. Elias sat against the damp wall, cradling her with arms that ached from more than just physical abuse, trying to process the impossible reality that he was a father, that this child existed because of one night beneath a broken angel, one moment of stolen tenderness in a world determined to keep them apart. The royal ring pressed into his palm where he'd clutched it alongside the baby. He examined it now in the dim light filtering through the cell's small window. Heavy gold worked with intricate detail, the king's seal prominent and unmistakable. Why had Amalia given it to him? What possible use could it serve? As proof of his crimes? As leverage? The gesture made no sense, yet she'd thrust it at him with desperate urgency, as if it held significance beyond its obvious value. Dawn approached with terrible inevitability. Soon they would come for him, lead him to the gallows, and what would become of Elena then? Would they take her back to the castle, raise her as some shameful secret, give her to the Duke to mold into whatever cruel shape pleased him? The thought made Elias's blood run cold. He pulled the baby closer, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, fast and delicate, like a bird's wing, and understood with sudden crushing clarity that his death would destroy more than just himself. It would condemn this innocent child to a fate possibly worse than death. The cell door opened as pale morning light began to seep through the dungeon's high windows. But it wasn't executioners who entered. It was a woman, elderly and bent, wearing servant's clothes and carrying supplies that suggested she'd come to tend the baby. Her face was weathered and kind, eyes sharp with intelligence despite her advanced years. "The princess sent me," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Before they took her away, she found me, begged me to help. I'm to take the child, hide her where the king's men won't think to look." Elias's arms tightened instinctively around Elena. "Where? How can I trust you?" "You can't," the woman said bluntly. But what choice do you have? In an hour you'll be dead, and this baby will be alone in a world that wants to use her as a pawn in games she can't possibly understand. I can get her out of the castle, take her somewhere safe, raise her until... She stopped, choosing her words carefully. Until circumstances change. Every instinct screamed at Elias to refuse, to hold on to this child who represented everything good that had somehow emerged from tragedy. But reason, cold and merciless, whispered that the old woman was right. His death was certain. Elena's only chance at survival, at any kind of life beyond being a political tool, lay in disappearing completely. "Tell me where," he demanded, his voice rough with barely suppressed anguish. "Tell me exactly where you'll take her so I can know, so I can die knowing she's safe." The woman hesitated, then leaned close, whispering an address in a distant village, a place so remote and insignificant that no one would think to search there. "I have family. They'll help. The child will want for nothing, I swear it." Elias looked down at Elena's sleeping face one final time, memorizing every detail. The curve of her cheek, the dark wisps of hair, the way her tiny fist curled against his chest. His daughter, his and Amalia's, the physical manifestation of a love that had been impossible from its inception, yet undeniable in its reality. Carefully, with movements that felt like tearing out his own heart, he transferred the baby into the old woman's arms. "Keep her safe," he whispered, the words breaking. "Tell her, when she's old enough to understand, tell her that her mother and father loved her more than life itself, that everything we did, every choice we made, was to protect her." The woman nodded, tears in her own eyes, and then she was gone, taking Elena with her, leaving Elias alone in the cell with nothing but the royal ring and a grief so profound it felt like drowning in ice water. They came for him shortly after, guards who avoided his eyes as they bound his hands and led him through the castle's corridors. Dawn had fully broken, painting the world in shades of pink and gold that seemed obscenely beautiful, given what was about to happen. The courtyard was already filled with spectators, nobles who'd come to witness justice, servants grateful for any break in their monotonous labor, commoners allowed in to see what happened to those who dared transgress against their betters. The gallows stood at the courtyard's center, stark and terrible, the noose swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Elias was led up the steps, each one feeling final and irrevocable, the wood solid beneath his feet. The executioner waited, hooded and silent, professional in his grim duty. A priest offered last rites, which Elias declined. What God would listen to prayers from a man who'd broken every law, divine and human, for love? The king stood on a raised platform, his face carved from stone, betraying no emotion. Beside him, Duke Fernando watched with undisguised satisfaction, and something about that expression, smug and vindictive, ignited a final spark of defiance in Elias's chest. He would not die begging, would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing him break. "Have you any final words?" the executioner asked, the traditional question delivered without inflection. Elias opened his mouth, prepared to die in silence, when a commotion erupted at the courtyard's entrance. Guards struggled with someone trying to force their way through, and then a voice cut through the morning air, clear, commanding, desperate. "Stop! In the name of God and justice, stop this execution!" The crowd parted, and Amalia appeared, flanked by guards, but somehow having convinced them to bring her here. She looked like she'd been through hell, her face bruised, her clothes torn, but her eyes blazed with fierce determination. In her arms she still carried Elena, who'd somehow been retrieved or never fully taken away. "Father!" she shouted, addressing the king directly, her voice carrying across the stunned silence that had fallen over the courtyard. "Before you execute this man, you will hear the truth, all of it. No more lies, no more secrets." The king's face darkened with fury. "Amalia, you will return to your chambers immediately." This matter is the only thing that matters." She climbed onto the platform despite the guards' attempts to restrain her, standing before the assembled crowd with the baby held high. "This is my daughter, mine and Elias's, conceived in love, hidden in fear, born in desperation. You want to know why I fled? Why I risked everything? It was to protect her from you, Father. From your ambitions, your political games, your arranged marriage to a monster who would have used her as leverage against me for the rest of my life. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The Duke's face went purple with rage, but Amalia pressed on, her words tumbling out with the force of a dam breaking. Duke Fernando knew about the baby, discovered the truth months ago, and threatened to expose everything unless I married him immediately. He said he'd claim the child as his own, raise her as his heir, use her to control me forever. I couldn't let that happen. So I ran, and when I learned you'd arrested Elias, that you planned to execute the only man who ever truly loved me, I had to come back. Had to tell you everything before. Silence. The king's roar cut through her confession. You dare admit this adultery, this treason, this... It wasn't treason, it was love. Amalia's voice broke, tears streaming down her face. Something you've never understood, something this entire court has forgotten exists. Elias saved my life, asked nothing in return, and when we found each other again, it wasn't calculated or political. It was real, more real than anything in this castle has ever been. She turned to Elias, still standing on the gallows with the noose inches from his neck, and their eyes met across the distance. In that look was everything: apology, love, desperate hope, and the terrible knowledge that confession might doom them both, but silence would destroy everything that mattered. I don't ask for mercy, Amalia said, turning back to her father. I don't ask for forgiveness, but I'm asking you to spare him. Execute me instead if you need a sacrifice, but let Elias live. Let him raise our daughter somewhere far from here, somewhere she can grow up knowing what real love looks like. The king stared at his daughter, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name. The entire courtyard held its breath, waiting for judgment that would reshape multiple lives with a single word. The Duke stepped forward, ready to demand harsh punishment, but the king raised a hand, silencing him. Guards, the king said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion and something that might have been grief. Remove the prisoner from the gallows. This execution is postponed. Hope flared in Elias's chest, fragile and terrifying. But the king wasn't finished. However, he continued, his eyes boring into both Amalia and Elias with terrible intensity. You will both leave this kingdom. Today, immediately. You will never return, never contact anyone from this court, never claim any connection to the royal family. The child will grow up as a commoner, and if I ever hear that you've attempted to use her status for gain, I will hunt you down myself. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened almost imperceptibly. But you will live, both of you. Take your child and go, before I change my mind. Amalia collapsed to her knees, sobbing with relief so intense it shook her entire body. But the Duke wasn't finished. You can't seriously... Your Majesty, this sets a precedent that... I said they will leave, the king interrupted, steel returning to his voice. And you, Duke Fernando, will return to your lands and never speak of this matter again, or I will ensure everyone learns exactly what kind of man you are. Do I make myself clear? The threat hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. The Duke's face twisted with impotent fury, but he nodded curtly and stalked away, his ambitions crushed. As guards removed the noose from Elias's neck and freed his bound hands, as Amalia rushed to him with Elena crying between them, as the crowd began to disperse with shocked whispers, Elias felt the ring still pressed against his palm and understood finally why Amalia had given it to him. Not as evidence or leverage, but as promise, that no matter what happened, no matter how far they had to run or how much they had to sacrifice, they would face it together, as a family. Before the castle gates closed behind them forever, Amalia pressed something else into his hand, a sealed letter, heavy with royal wax. Open it only when we're safe, she whispered. It's my father's final gift. Freedom tasted like ash and blood. They fled the castle with nothing but the clothes on their backs, Elena's desperate cries and the weight of exile pressing down on them like stones. The world beyond the castle gates stretched vast and unforgiving, each step taking them further from everything Amalia had known, deeper into a future without certainty or safety. Elias led them through the forest paths he'd once walked as a simple woodcutter, when life had been hard but comprehensible, before love had transformed him into a fugitive carrying a princess and their daughter toward an uncertain fate. They traveled for days, keeping to remote roads and avoiding villages where questions might be asked. Elena cried often, hungry and cold, and watching Amalia struggle to comfort her, this woman who'd been raised surrounded by servants, who'd never had to do anything for herself, filled Elias with a complex mixture of admiration and heartbreak. She never complained, never looked back with regret, but he saw the toll exile took on her in the shadows beneath her eyes, the way her hands trembled when she thought he wasn't watching. On the fifth night, huddled in an abandoned shepherd's hut with rain pounding the roof and wind howling through gaps in the walls, they finally opened the letter the king had given them. The seal broke with a soft crack, and Amalia's hands shook as she unfolded the parchment, reading by the light of their meager fire. Her face went white, then red, then crumpled entirely as tears began streaming down her cheeks. "He knew," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My father knew everything. About us, about the baby, about Fernando's threats. He knew all of it." Elias felt his blood run cold. "Then why?" "He says he was trying to protect me." Amalia's laugh was bitter and broken. "That he'd hoped to quietly annul the engagement to Fernando. Find me a better match. Give me time to—" She stopped, unable to continue, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "But then I ran, and everything spiraled out of control. And he couldn't stop it without admitting he'd known and done nothing. So he let events play out, hoping somehow to salvage the situation." The letter detailed everything: the king's desperate attempts to manage the scandal, his fury at Fernando's manipulation, his genuine fear for his daughter's safety. And at the end, a confession that gutted them both. The king had ordered Elias's arrest not to punish him, but to protect him, to keep him safely imprisoned until the duke's rage cooled and exile could be arranged. The execution had been theater, a performance meant to satisfy the noble's demands for justice, while the king worked behind scenes to save them all. "He says he's sorry," Amalia whispered, staring at her father's handwriting through tears. "That he failed me as a father, chose politics over protection, and that he hopes someday I might forgive him. That he hopes Elena will grow up loved and safe, which is more than he could guarantee if we'd stayed." The weight of this knowledge settled over them like a shroud. The king hadn't been their enemy. He'd been a flawed man caught between duty and love, making impossible choices with no good options. Understanding this didn't erase the pain, but it transformed it into something more complex, more human. Weeks became months. They eventually settled in a small village at the kingdom's edge, so remote it barely appeared on maps. Elias returned to woodcutting, his hands remembering the familiar rhythm of axe against tree, while Amalia learned to cook, to clean, to perform all the mundane tasks that had once been invisible to her. The adjustment was brutal. Her hands blistered and bled. Her body ached from labor it had never been designed for, and sometimes Elias found her crying silently in the night, mourning a life she'd voluntarily abandoned. But there were moments of surprising beauty too. The first time Elena smiled, her tiny face lighting up with innocent joy. The evening Amalia successfully baked bread without burning it, her laugh of triumph echoing through their small cabin. The nights they lay together beneath rough blankets, Elena sleeping between them, and felt something that might have been peace settling over their makeshift family. Winter came again, harsh and unforgiving. Food grew scarce and Elias worked longer hours, his body pushed to its limits trying to provide for his family. Amalia never complained, but he saw her growing thinner, saw the way she gave Elena the larger portions of their meager meals, sacrificing her own needs without hesitation. The princess who'd never known want now understood hunger intimately, and somehow she faced it with more grace than most nobles showed in abundance. Then, on a morning when frost painted the world white, riders appeared on the horizon. Elias's heart stopped, terror flooding his veins. Had the king changed his mind? Had Fernando convinced him to renege on his promise? He grabbed the axe, prepared to defend his family with his life, but Amalia caught his arm, her face pale but steady. "Wait," she said quietly. "Look at the banners." The riders carried royal colors, but their approach was slow, non-threatening. The leader dismounted, holding out his hands to show he was unarmed. "I bring word from the king," he announced formally, "and a summons." The summons demanded Elias's immediate return to the castle for trial. New evidence had surfaced, testimony from servants who'd witnessed the stable encounter, the glove that had been found and traced back to its owner, accounts of suspicious meetings. Duke Fernando, furious at being denied his prize, had pressured the king relentlessly, calling in political favors and threatening alliances. The nobility demanded justice, and the king, his position weakened by the scandal, had no choice but to comply. "You don't have to go," Amalia said desperately as the guards waited for Elias's response. "We can run, hide somewhere they'll never find us, and spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders." Elias cupped her face gently, memorizing every detail. "Watching Elena grow up in fear, always moving, never safe. I won't do that to either of you. They'll kill you." Her voice was flat, certain, devastated. "Fernando will make sure of it. He wants revenge, and my father's too weak to stop him now. Then at least Elena will have you." Elias pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her heart beat against his chest one final time. "Raise her strong. Teach her that love is worth any price, even this one. And tell her," his voice broke, "tell her that her father loved her mother more than life itself." The ride back to the castle felt like a funeral procession. Elias sat bound on horseback, watching the familiar landscape pass with new eyes, knowing he'd never see it again. The forest where he'd saved Amalia seemed darker now, haunted by the ghost of the man he'd been before love had consumed and transformed him. The trial was swift and brutal. Fernando had spent months building his case, gathering witnesses and evidence, constructing a narrative of seduction and treason that painted Elias as a scheming peasant who deliberately pursued the princess for personal gain. The fact that Amalia had returned to save him at the execution was twisted into evidence of his manipulative power over her, proof that he'd corrupted an innocent royal with peasant cunning. Elias sat in chains before the assembly of nobles, listening to his character destroyed and his motives perverted, and said nothing. What defense could he offer? That he'd loved her? That their connection had been real? These people would never understand. Love was currency to them, not sacrament. Passion was leverage, not truth. The king sat on his throne, visibly aged since Elias had last seen him, his face etched with exhaustion and something that might have been guilt. Their eyes met briefly, and in that exchange, Elias saw apology and helplessness. The king had tried to protect them, but politics had won, as it always did in the end. "The penalty for treason is death," the chief magistrate announced, his voice echoing through the vast hall. "However, in consideration of your service to the crown in saving Princess Amalia's life, His Majesty has shown mercy. Instead of execution, you will be exiled permanently, forbidden from ever returning to this kingdom or contacting any member of the royal family. Should you violate this decree, death will be immediate." Relief and despair warred in Elias's chest. He would live, but at what cost? Permanent separation from Amalia and Elena, forbidden from watching his daughter grow, from being any part of their lives. It was a different kind of death, slower, lonelier, more cruel in its way than a quick drop from the gallows. But then the magistrate continued, and Elias's world shattered completely. Furthermore, the child born of this illicit union will remain in royal custody. As the king's granddaughter, regardless of the circumstances of her conception, she cannot be allowed to grow up in poverty and obscurity. She will be raised in the castle under proper supervision. "No!" Amalia's scream tore through the hall as she burst from the crowd, Elena clutched in her arms. Guards had been holding her back, but she'd broken free, her face wild with maternal fury. "You can't take her! She's my daughter! I won't let you!" Guards converged on her, prying Elena from her grip as she fought with desperate strength. The baby's cries pierced the air, and watching Amalia's hands reaching futilely as Elena was carried away, seeing the woman he loved break completely, was worse than any torture Elias had endured in the dungeons. "Please," Elias found himself shouting, straining against his chains. "Please, your majesty, I'll do anything. I'll confess to whatever crimes you want, accept any punishment, but please don't separate them. Please." The king's face was carved from stone, betraying nothing, but something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or the ghost of the father he'd once tried to be. "The decision is final. Take the prisoner away." As guards dragged Elias from the hall, his last sight was of Amalia collapsed on the floor, reaching toward the door where Elena had disappeared, her screams echoing off stone walls with a grief so profound it seemed to crack the very foundations of the castle. The castle gates closed behind him for what he thought was the final time, and Elias was thrust back into the world, alone, broken, forbidden from the only things that had ever given his life meaning. The exile who waited for him pressed a small pouch into his hands, travel money perhaps, or the king's final gesture of guilt, but Elias barely noticed. He walked away from the castle as snow began to fall, each flake a cold kiss against his face, and tried to understand how love, pure, real, transformative love, had led to this complete destruction. Behind him, he imagined he could still hear Amalia's screams, and the sound would haunt him for years to come, a ghost that never quite faded. But what neither of them knew, what no one in that hall had realized, was that Amalia had managed to scream one final thing as they dragged her away, words that would echo across the years and reshape everything. "She's not yours to take. The king himself promised us freedom." And in the chaos, those words hung in the air like a prophecy, waiting for their moment to transform everything once again. The years passed like water through cupped hands, impossible to hold, leaving only the ghost of their passage. Elias returned to the forest where everything had begun, building a new cabin near the clearing where he'd first saved Amalia from the bear. The location wasn't coincidence, but pilgrimage, a desperate attempt to remain close to the memory of a moment when the world had briefly made sense. He chopped wood, hauled water, existed in the mechanical rhythm of survival, but he was no longer truly alive. Part of him had died in that throne room, watching Elena torn from Amalia's arms, hearing screams that still echoed in his dreams. He never remarried, never looked at another woman with anything beyond hollow politeness. The villagers whispered about the strange hermit who lived alone in the forest, who sometimes stood staring at nothing for hours, whose eyes held a grief so profound it made people uncomfortable to witness. They didn't know his story. The official version said only that a peasant had been exiled for unnamed crimes, but they sensed the tragedy clinging to him like morning fog. Winter returned each year with cruel consistency, painting the world white and reminding him of blood on snow, of a princess's pale face, of the moment his entire existence had pivoted toward this lonely ending. He kept the golden ribbon, now faded and frayed, hidden in a box beneath his bed alongside the letter from the king. Sometimes, in his darkest moments, he reread it, trying to find comfort in the knowledge that the king had tried to protect them, that their suffering hadn't been entirely meaningless. But the words offered cold comfort against the reality of endless separation. News filtered slowly to his remote cabin, carried by traveling merchants and wandering priests. He learned that Amalia had been confined to the castle, kept under constant supervision, forbidden from leaving or communicating with the outside world, that Elena was being raised by nurses and tutors, groomed for some political marriage that would serve the kingdom's interests, that Duke Fernando had eventually married another noble's daughter, though rumors suggested the union was loveless and cruel. Each piece of information was a fresh wound, proof that the world continued spinning while his own had stopped completely. 7 years crawled by, 7 winters, 7 springs that brought renewal to everything except his heart. Elias aged beyond his years, his face weathered and lined, his body still strong from labor, but his eyes holding a weariness that spoke of deeper exhaustion. He'd stopped hoping, stopped imagining impossible scenarios where they might be reunited. Hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. Then, on an autumn afternoon when golden light filtered through the trees and the air smelled of dying leaves and approaching winter, he heard it, the sound that had haunted his memory for nearly a decade. A child's laughter, bright and clear, cutting through the forest silence like a bell. Elias looked up from his work, axe frozen mid-swing, hardly daring to breathe. Through the trees he saw movement. A young girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, running between the pines with the unconscious grace of childhood. She wore a simple dress, her dark hair caught back with a ribbon that gleamed golden in the dappled sunlight. And when she turned, laughing at something he couldn't see, his heart stopped completely. His eyes. She had his eyes, the exact shade, the same shape, unmistakable even across the distance. But it was more than that. Something in the way she moved, the tilt of her head, the curve of her smile, all whispered of Amalia, of genetics expressing themselves in ways that transcended simple feature inheritance. Helena. The name escaped him as barely a whisper, too quiet to carry, but the girl stopped running, turning toward him as if she'd heard anyway. For a long moment they simply stared at each other across the clearing, a man and a child who shared blood but had never met, connected by bonds neither fully understood. Then another figure emerged from the trees, a woman, moving more slowly, her hand pressed to her chest as if the journey had winded her. When she stepped into the light, Elias felt the world tilt sickeningly. Amalia. Older, thinner, her face marked by years of confinement and grief, but unmistakably, impossibly her. Their eyes met, and time collapsed. 7 years vanished in an instant, and they were back in the garden beneath the broken angel, in the stables during the thunderstorm, in the throne room reaching for each other across an unbridgeable divide. She moved toward him slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might shatter this impossible moment, tears already streaming down her face. "You're here," she whispered when close enough to touch. "After all this time, you're still here. I never left." Elias's voice was rough, unused to emotion after years of isolation. "I couldn't. This place, it's all I had left of us." Elena watched them with curious eyes, intelligent and perceptive, clearly understanding that something significant was happening, even if she didn't grasp the full context. "Mama," she said softly, tugging at Amalia's sleeve. "Is this him? Is this the man you told me about?" Amalia nodded, unable to speak, and Elena stepped forward with the fearless directness of children. "My mother says you saved her life once, that you're the bravest person she's ever known." She studied his face with unsettling intensity. "She says I have your eyes." The simplicity of it, the matter-of-fact way she stated this profound truth, nearly broke him. Elias sank to his knees, bringing himself to her level, and really looked at his daughter for the first time since she'd been torn from Amalia's arms as an infant. She was beautiful, intelligent, bearing traces of both parents in features that would someday break hearts. But more than physical resemblance, there was something in her bearing, a quiet strength, a gentle defiance, that spoke of having been raised by a woman who refused to let captivity crush her spirit. "Your mother," Elias said carefully, his voice thick with emotion, "is the strongest person I've ever known. And you're more precious than anything in this world." Elena smiled, and the expression transformed her face into something radiant. Then, with the uncomplicated affection of children who haven't yet learned to guard their hearts, she wrapped her arms around his neck and hugged him. The gesture, so simple and yet so profound, shattered what remained of Elias's carefully maintained composure. He held his daughter, feeling her small heartbeat, her warm breath against his neck, and wept openly for the first time in years. When Elena eventually pulled back, running off to explore the clearing with childish curiosity, Amalia sank down beside Elias, her own tears flowing freely. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for taking so long, for letting years pass. After the trial, they locked me away, watching constantly, convinced I'd try to escape again. But 6 months ago, the king, my father, he died." The news hit Elias like a physical blow. The king, that complex man who'd tried to protect them and failed, who'd carried his own guilt and regret, gone. His final decree, Amalia continued, her voice breaking, granted me full custody of Elena and revoked all previous restrictions. He left us money, property outside the kingdom, and a letter. She stopped, pulling out a sealed parchment with trembling hands. A letter addressed to you. He wanted you to have this. Elias broke the seal with numb fingers, unfolding parchment that felt heavy with meaning. The king's handwriting was shakier than before, marked by illness and age, but the words were clear. Elias, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I write to offer what I should have given years ago, truth and apology. I failed my daughter by choosing politics over protection. I failed you by allowing nobles' demands to override justice. I failed Elena by separating her from the father who would have loved her unconditionally. These failures have haunted my final years more than any of my supposed successes as king. Therefore, I use my last authority to grant what should never have been taken. Freedom. Full royal pardons for both you and Amalia. Restoration of rights. And my blessing on your union. Raise Elena with the love I was too cowardly to defend. Show her that honor sometimes means defying the world rather than appeasing it. And know this. In the moments before death clarifies everything, I've realized that your love for my daughter was the truest nobility I ever witnessed in my court. I'm sorry I couldn't see it clearly while it mattered. With regret and hope, the king. Elias read the words 3 times, barely believing them. A pardon. Freedom. The king's blessing, granted when it could no longer cost him politically. It was everything and nothing. Too late to erase years of suffering, but enough to finally release them from invisible chains. We're free, Amalia whispered, as if saying it aloud might make it real. Truly free, no exile, no separation, no forbidden anything. We can finally be a family. The word hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Family. Something they'd created against impossible odds. Something that had survived separation, grief, and years of enforced distance. Elias looked at Elena, now examining a butterfly with intense fascination, then back at Amalia, and felt something long dormant stirring in his chest. Not hope exactly, but its gentler cousin, possibility. The cabin's small, he said, gesturing toward his humble home. And I don't have much to offer. You have everything, Amalia interrupted, taking his scarred hands in her own. You have love that survived 7 years of separation. You have loyalty that withstood exile and loss. You have a heart that kept beating even when the world tried to crush it. That's not nothing, Elias. That's everything. The sun was setting, painting the forest in shades of amber and gold. Elena ran back to them, clutching wildflowers she'd gathered, her face glowing with simple joy. Can we stay here? She asked, looking between her parents. Mama said this is where you first met, that this place is special. Elias looked at the clearing where he'd faced a bear, where blood had stained snow, where his old life had ended and something impossible had begun. Then he looked at his daughter, at the woman he'd never stopped loving, and felt the weight of years beginning to lift. Yes, he said quietly. We can stay, for as long as you want. As darkness fell, and they moved toward the cabin, Elena chattering excitedly between them, Amalia's hand finding his. Elias felt the golden ribbon in his pocket, the one he'd kept for nearly 8 years. Pulling it out, he watched as a sudden breeze caught it, lifting it from his palm and sending it dancing through the air. It spun and twisted, catching the last rays of sunset, before disappearing between the trees, carried away like a prayer finally answered, a burden finally released. The ribbon was gone, but what it represented remained. Love that had survived impossible odds. Sacrifice that had ultimately meant something. A family forged in adversity and tempered by time. And as they crossed the threshold into the small cabin that would become their home, Elias understood that some stories don't end. They transform, finding new beginnings in the ruins of their tragedies. Behind them, the forest settled into evening silence, and if you listened carefully, you might have heard it. The echo of a promise kept, the whisper of love stronger than exile, the quiet triumph of 2 hearts that refused to stop beating for each other, no matter how hard the world tried to tear them apart. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't holding on, it's surviving long enough to hold on again. Elias and Amalia's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee a happy ending, that loving someone with your whole heart can cost you everything, and that sometimes courage looks less like a hero's charge and more like simply waking up each day and choosing not to give up. Would you have thrown yourself between death and a stranger? Would you have sacrificed your freedom for one stolen moment? Would you have waited 7 years in the wilderness, clinging to a faded ribbon and the ghost of a promise, not knowing if you'd ever see them again? Their love didn't conquer through grand gestures or dramatic rescues. It conquered through quiet persistence, through refusing to let separation kill what they'd built, through believing that some connections transcend even the cruelest circumstances. The king's final letter reminds us that regret is the heaviest crown anyone can wear, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person in power can do is admit they were wrong. Elias and Amalia teach us that real love isn't found in fairy tales where everything works out easily. It's forged in the brutal spaces between hope and despair, where you choose each other again and again, even when the world has given you every reason to let go. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real in a world that often feels numb, don't let it end here. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to remember that love, real, messy, impossible love, is worth fighting for. Subscribe to follow more stories that will break your heart and put it back together. Because sometimes we all need to be reminded that even in our darkest moments, even when everything seems lost, some lights refuse to go out, some loves refuse to die. And some stories, no matter how painful, deserve to be told.